So first to Professor John Blaxland, who is one of our most eminent military historians and a Sky regular. He joins me in our Canberra studio. John, welcome back. Thanks
for joining us. Good to be with you, Catherine.
Look, I think there's a notion we hear often in the Australian public debate about other people's wars. Explain to this generation why what seems to be a very strange decision for a new Commonwealth to go off to first Gallipoli and then onto the Western Front in Europe. What was that about in terms of sane strategic behaviour?
Yeah, so it's important to remember that Australia wasn't really a fully independent nation in 1914. When Britain declared war, Australia was effectively automatically at war as well, because we hadn't, with the Statute of Westminster had yet to be enacted, we had yet to actually be in a position to formulate our own foreign and defence policy. But beyond that, we're also very much trade dependent on Britain.
Yes.
So our principal trading partner was Britain through the Suez Canal and the Middle East. But people forget also that in 1914, the German Empire included New Guinea.
And Rabaul, indeed, was the first
And
operation.
Rabaul, the Australian Naval and Military Expeditionary Force in August 1914, was launched against the German forces there and the German colony there. And the very establishment of the Royal Australian Navy in 1911, which the fleet arrived in 1913, deliberately scaled to outgun the German East Asian fleet.
Absolutely.
People forget that the Germans were actually part of this neck of the woods back then.
Indeed, and the Emden was sunk in our region as well.
Indeed, by the Sydney. Beached and done for, as they say. But, you know, we forget that, and we think that Germany is a European power that had no interest in this part of the world.
Yeah.
It had real interests, and arguably the reason why that East Asian fleet departed without fighting the Australian Navy in that battle over Rabaul was because they knew they were outgunned. And that was a very deliberate choice made by the Australian government to formulate a defence force with muscle, with reach and with deterrence capability. The Germans fled. They fled across the Pacific. They had a battle off the coast of Chile and then the Battle of the Falklands where they got annihilated by the Royal Navy. But we think that that's something far, far away. We don't make the connection with our own circumstances.
And the other thing, and it remains true to this day, but walk our audience through the fact that Australia, for very selfish reasons, strategic realism, aligns with the dominant maritime power in that we're, in the terms of one writer, a net importer of security through our sea lines of communication being maintained by the dominant maritime power. And that was an instalment on the insurance policy.
Absolutely. So buying in on that and making a contribution towards that was critical. A contribution of direct relevance to Australia's neighbourhood, mindful that at that stage the British Empire seemed pretty strong, but of course it didn't prove to be quite as strong as to be able to sustain operations in the Pacific while worried about the German fleet in the North Sea. Now, the defeat of the Germans then led us to be able to operate alongside the Brits, supporting their efforts in the Battle of Jutland and the North Sea thereafter. But it's important to keep in mind the significance of our contribution to fleet engagements in our neck of the woods. In the Second World War, similar sort of circumstances where the Germans are out of the equation, but Australia had to be able to make its own contribution as well.
Yes.
And that's important. So, yeah, it's interesting to look back in hindsight at those periods in the post-Second World War period, and because people think, oh, but that seems so remote from today. You know, it seems so unrelated to our circumstances today. And well, look, we have lived through 75 odd years since the end of the Second War with the atomic weapons. We haven't had them fired in anger since 1945. We've had the United Nations established, a series of mechanisms that are about international principles and standards that we like to try and adhere to. And in Australia's case, we've got the alliances. So those three pillars, mutually assured destruction effectively through the atomic weapons that the Russians and the Chinese ended up getting as well. The UN mechanisms and the international law, a great global order, if you like, and the alliance system has been what the bedrock of Australia's foreign and defence policy now for longer than you and I can remember.
Of course. And you made the important point that we were axiomatically at war, as it were, because of our dominion status. But even more importantly, I think people overlook the social change in that it was a confederation of colonies loosely affiliated. And if you're a constitutional lawyer you would look back to that period and see in very short order a couple of big national security cases,
Yeah.
and then the engineers' decision in 1920, which changed the federal balance. So the nation, the legacy of the Great War was an Australian Commonwealth on the world stage. Would you agree with that assessment?
Absolutely. It was also a broken nation. And Joan Beaumont spoke about this in her magisterial history of the First World War. The impact of the war on Australia was to break us, but also help generate this, this sense of identity. Now, some people rail against the ANZAC legend,
Yes.
the ANZAC myth, and Zachary, as some people call it.
Yeah.
And look, to be fair, it can be overplayed,
Yeah.
and it's important to keep it in perspective.
Yeah.
But the young Australia of 1915 really was looking for, it had no bombs bursting in air, American Revolutionary War, or kind of French Revolution. No martial moment for its creation.
Absolutely.
And in the absence of that, there's no founding myths that were compelling.
Yes.
And so the ANZAC experience of Gallipoli, really, it's kind of, it has resonance even to this day.
Absolutely.
Now, it's interesting to see who kind of buys in on the ANZAC myth and ANZAC legend stuff of today. Now, we talk about at ANZAC Day, we talk about the ANZAC spirit. For starters, the connections with New Zealand are really significant.
Yes.
And for our engagement in the Pacific, New Zealand's critical. And we can't afford to forget the NZ in ANZAC. We really can't.
Totally. And they fought extremely well on the Western Front too. There were many who said that New Zealand division was in fact the best formation on the Western Front.
And we forget at our peril that New Zealand's been instrumental to our successes in recent decades.
Yep.
In East Timor,
Absolutely.
where they came alongside us, in Bougainville, in Solomon Islands, and in keeping peace in the Pacific writ large, let alone their engagement with us alongside in the five-power defence arrangement in Malaysia and Singapore.
Yeah.
So the connection with New Zealand is really important. But I like to dwell on a little bit for a moment there, the mythology, the Britain coming back into our lives a little bit. It's kind of, it's interesting, isn't it?
That blindsided me, I have to say.
They walked away from us back when they joined the European Economic Community.
67,
In 1973 they formally joined, but 67 it was unravelling throughout the 60s.
The withdrawal east of Suez.
East of Suez Declaration, that's right. But what we see, so they left us, and look, New Zealand was much more worse affected than we were. But they've come back. They're playing now not as a superior to a subordinate, but as a peer with an interest in our neighbourhood. And I think we need to be fairly sanguine about how much they can do, particularly if they face a crisis at their end of the Eurasian landmass. I think that's fair. But I think it's interesting to think about now when we think about AUKUS, we think about our relationship with Britain and the United States. How do we reconcile our geography with our history? And some of the pundits, and Paul Keating was one of them, criticising the government for trying to find security from Asia than in Asia.
Yeah.
I don't buy that.
It's a tired old line.
I don't buy that. I mean, we're more engaged in Southeast Asia and beyond Southeast Asia, in South Asia and East Asia than ever.
And that's where I want to hit the fast forward button tonight, because the themes that were established by our participation in the Great War, it was not other people's wars. We had direct interests in being engaged as deeply as we were.
No question.
Notwithstanding the horrific casualties in a small country. But that theme, that golden thread, as you've referred to, takes us forward to today. Now, explain to the audience why this argument is so important in light of developments with China this week, the argument about what now looks like Xi absolutely establishing a stranglehold on power, and some mixed messages on climate collaboration with the United States, but preparing to clearly destroy US ships inside the second island chain.
Yeah.
So the more things change, the more they stay the same.
Yeah, look, I've just been reading this great book by John Moses, who was very prominent back in the day when I was doing my HSC exam.
Yep.
He was instrumental in the debate about war guilt for the First World War.
I do recall that.
You remember?
Yes.
And the Fisher-Moses debate.
Yes.
And he's written this book, just come out a little while ago, First Know Your Enemy, Comprehending Imperial German War Aims and Deciphering the Enigma of German Kultur. And he makes the point that Germany under Kaiser Wilhelm was actually a dictatorial state that had a very much a war footing. And we're seeing eerily a parallel today
Quite.
of a dictatorial state. We've just seen President Xi declared, chairman for life, effectively, with a militarism that echoes uncannily the Wilhelmine German sensation of angst and being unsatisfied at being second to Britain, wanting to eclipse Britain. And you think, why? Why can't you just get along, make it work?
They were one another's biggest trading partners.
And they were cousins. The kings
Indeed.
were cousins, the king and queen,
And that's where I think the flaw in Paul Keating's argument. Look, I had plenty of respect for him in many ways and still do, but to make that case, I just thought was very weak, frankly, because to cast us as the sort of white colonial legacy in Asia.
That's not Australia today.
No.
It might have been Australia when he became an MP in 1969.
100%. But the region are
Not today.
coalescing around fear of China. That's the case, isn't it?
Yeah, look, even our Southeast Asian neighbours, even though they're not prepared to all that loudly declare their support for Australia's position, by and large, they're kind of rooting for us.
Understood.
But I think it's important to bear in mind what we're facing is not a Cold War 2.0. And I think I like to talk about it as being 6 C's in the 1 C, a continuum from cooperation, and on some things we are cooperating.
Yep.
And then there's competition, and we're competing on other things. And then there's coercion, and we're seeing that in the South China Sea.
Yes.
And then we're seeing conflict.
Yeah.
And we're seeing that in the cyber domain. We're seeing that with foreign direct interference.
Yes.
And we're seeing this on a range of fronts in space, in cyber, in domestic politics. With it was very interesting hearing Chris Uhlmann on Q&A the other night on the other channel.
Yeah.
But talking about the significance of people who are of Chinese origin in Australia feeling threatened here by extraterritorial, the reach of the Chinese state inside Australia.
And they passed legislation to that effect.
Yeah, so I think we need to, it's not a war or peace, we're actually in a continuum between cooperation and conflict, and at every stage there's something involved. And so we've just seen, the United States declare that they're going to do a deal with China over the environment, cooperation, okay? But it's not happening in isolation. And the United States hopefully will have their eyes well and truly open to all the other shenanigans that are happening on the side.